Hello and welcome to our fourth lesson in our course on dodging and burning here at Retouching Academy. So this is the final lesson, and we're not going to be talking about dodging and burning per se. We're going to kind of, do a little bit of localized dodging and burning, but for the most part, we're talking about sort of the things that surround it. So what are things that you have to consider and things that you need to address when you're working with dodging and burning? And primarily our focus here is going to be on color. So how do we get ourselves away from using things like frequency separation and, do the same thing non-destructively while factoring in dodging and burning. So we've already briefly talked about the process of clipping hue saturation adjustments to our dodge and burn curves when we're doing our localized or corrective dodge and burn. Sort of making that adjustment, and we're going to look at that briefly today, but for the most part we're going to be looking at some techniques for actually fixing color issues and how we identify them. So we're going to be using this image here, and we're going to fix a couple of different things, so it's going to keep us fairly busy. And so basically I've just gone ahead and kind of done 3 different adjustments, but we're going to look at a few others as well. And so I'll kind of show you what we're going to be doing here. We're going to look at this area of the mouth here, which if we essentially we hide this layer here, we can see that there's obviously a color issue there. And then also in the eye area, we have this shadow because we're using very hard light here. The light was fairly high up, and so oftentimes the lashes will cast a shadow and create this shadow here. Whether you remove it or not, that's kind of your decision, but I think it's a good example for how we can work with luminosities and adjustment layers to fix something like this without relying on something like frequency separation. And then finally, we're going to look at things in the eyes. So for example, if you look at this area over here, then we have this kind of shadow being cast at the bottom here. So we're going to look at how we fix that and how we fix color shifts that result as well. And we're going to take a brief look at things like, these sort of patchier areas here where we have a little bit of peach fuzz on the cheek and how we can kind of mitigate that and make it less pronounced. And then, perhaps we'll spend a little bit of time on the lips as well, I think. The lips here are pretty good, but I'll kind of give you an idea of what you would do to fix any sort of issues with the lips. But they all pretty much follow through the same process. So I think, with these examples in place, you'll be able to apply them to a variety of scenarios. So let's go ahead and I think let's start with this because I think it's a relatively simple issue to fix. So we have these 2 solid color fill layers here that are going to give us some help. And essentially what I've gone ahead and done is just created a solid color layer, just like we did before, and just select sort of a middle gray sort of thing. And then if you want to visualize just the luminosity information, then you're going to set it to color blend mode. I know it's kind of counterintuitive because you think that if I want to see just luminosity, I select luminosity, but basically we're taking things away, we're sort of negating here, so that's why we're going to pick the opposite. If we want to see just the color, then we're going to select luminosity. So that's basically what I've done for these 2. One does color, one does luminosity, just like I showed you in this previous example here. So let's go ahead and get started with this area. And obviously, looking at it, we know that there is an issue of some sort, but it may not be readily sort of immediately noticeable what that issue is. Now, if we go to our luminosity, we see that there are some variances in luminosity here, but some of those may not necessarily be a bad thing. Naturally, the mouth kind of concaves in this area, so we don't necessarily want to flatten this all out so that it is one luminosity going across, because that's not really realistic. There should be a concave in, and then generally there's a little sort of divot going out and then back down again, so that's why it's catching the light that way. So while we do want to maybe fix some of these little micro issues here in a local dodge and burn sort of scenario, we don't necessarily want to get rid of this whole bit here. So I think overall we're not really dealing with much of a luminosity issue here. On the other hand, if we select our color one, we can see that obviously there is something going on here, right? I mean, what we're generally looking for when we look at something like this is just out of place color shifts that really shouldn't be there. So this is immediately noticeable to me that, like, why are we seeing this really colorful patch here when it doesn't really exist anywhere in the surroundings? For something like this here, we see a color shift in this area simply because there is this shadow. So, you have to factor that in, that, shadow areas will have different color, different levels of saturation, so they'll appear differently here. So you can kind of, ignore those. What we're really looking for is just random patches where, the color just shifts and just doesn't look like it blends properly. And so that's sort of an immediately noticeable thing to me. So let's go ahead and address that. Now, again, for me, kind of practice has got me to the point where I pretty much know what I need to do to fix it. But if you don't know if the issue is one of hue or saturation, then a quick test that you can do, and, you're not going to be doing this every time, but if you're really not sure, we can just grab this chunk here that we think we have a problem with. And so this is part of the lip here, so we don't necessarily want to grab that. So we'll just grab our lasso tool and make a selection of that area. So something like that. And then we're going to hit Command-J to essentially duplicate it. Let's go back to our layer and let's grab samples from areas that are around it. So, somewhere above here, somewhere around here, and maybe something below. So that's kind of just going to be our sampling average. So we're going to hit Command-J to duplicate that again. And then what we want to do is hold down the Command key or Control key and then click on the layer itself. That's going to create a mask around our surroundings. And you have to do that in order to use the average tool. Otherwise, it will factor in the transparency in that layer, and you're just going to get the wrong value. So just make sure you select it before you use the average command. And this is basically going to give us the average sort of color that's there. And then let's go ahead and grab our other layer. This is the original layer of our patch here. Again, holding down Command or Control. There we go. And we're going to go to average again. So you can hit Command F2 if you prefer. So there's our sort of issues here. Let's go ahead and just blend these two together. I'm just going to hit Command E to merge them, and then we're going to go to our color picker. So let's go ahead and click on this. And this is basically giving us that average of that color in that area. So this is, we have our hue, which is kind of reddish, and then we're not super saturated here. We're kind of right in the middle of luminosity as well. And we're not so much interested in this up and down because the luminosity we know is probably correct. What we're really looking for is, does it shift left and right, so saturation changes, or does this move up and down, which are the hue changes? So let's go ahead and click here now. And what do we really get between these? We can see that it's pretty much a saturation issue almost entirely. I mean, you don't really see this move at all. Let's click on this area and this area. Again, there's no shift in hue whatsoever. So the hue is actually pretty good. It's really just a saturation issue in this particular area. So that pretty much immediately tells us how we're going to fix this. We're going to grab a hue saturation adjustment, and naturally we're going to desaturate. So let's go ahead and get rid of this. We don't need it anymore. And there's a couple of different ways that you can tackle this. Either we can, use the Q command, which is going to be quick mask, and then we can sort of mask this in, or we can just make a selection around it, which is typically what I'll do. So again, I'll just kind of reselect this a little bit more carefully this time. I think probably something like that. Then we're going to hit our Q key for the quick mask, and we're going to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. So we want to just feather this out a little bit. So pick the appropriate radius depending on the size of the area for something like this. Probably around 9 or 10 pixels will be good. And then we'll hit Q again. So there's our selection of our offending area. And then we're going to go ahead and grab a hue saturation adjustment. And you can either operate on the master, since everything is pretty uniform here, or we can just grab reds and just sample that particular color. And then we're going to just start pulling the saturation down until we think it looks good. So probably somewhere in around there. Now we can see if we go too far, then things are kind of looking off. So you can pretty easily tell when it's correct and when it isn't. Now, there are some areas that are more saturated than others. Like over here, the saturation is a little bit higher, and actually there's a little patch over here that's too saturated too. So what we can do too is we can go a little bit beyond what we should be. And generally, you want to kind of go until it fixes the most saturated point, and then we can roll it back by masking. So let's go ahead and just pull this a little bit more than we think we should. So probably to around -22. And then we're going to grab our brush. We're going to select black as our color, and painting at about 2% flow, just like we do with our dodge and burn. We're just going to start to slowly mask out areas that we think are now too desaturated. And there's some areas here that I want to just desaturate too. So now I'm painting in white. There's a little patch here, patch there. So whatever we didn't grab with our original lasso tool, I'm just going to kind of touch up. A little bit down here. Now I'm painting in black, just taking out certain areas that I still feel are too desaturated. And painting white again. This is just kind of like what we're doing with dodging and burning, but we're working on saturation issues instead. All right, so something like that. All right, now if we go to our color, we can see that that transitions a lot better. I mean, if we just, make that shift there, and we can see that there's a couple little areas here that we could theoretically paint in white just to smooth that out, kind of here. And again, you have to be careful to factor in luminosity shifts here, but we can use this to just help us visualize things a little bit. So let's go ahead and turn that off. So that pretty much fixes that issue for us. Again, kind of toggling that on and off. We can see what that's doing for us, and of course it still requires a little bit of dodging and burning, but certainly getting us to where we want to be. So that is one area. Now the next area we're going to tackle is that shadow under the eye, and that's going to be a little bit more complex, and we're going to use a few different techniques there.